Hello and welcome to this edition of Two People on the Planet. And today's very special guest is Dr. Michael Rectenwald. He is the author of 12 books, including his most recent, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Thought Criminal, Beyond Woke, The Google Archipelago, and Springtime for Snowflakes. And we'll be talking more about each of those in the course of this conversation. So Dr. Rectenwald holds a PhD in Literary and Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon University, a Master's in English Literature from Case Western University, and a BA in English Literature from the University of Pittsburgh. A former Marxist, Professor Rectenwald is now a champion of liberty and opposes all forms of totalitarianism, including socialism, communism, social justice, fascism, political correctness, and woke ideology. So, welcome, Dr. Rectenwald.
Thanks for having me, Carl. Great to be here.
Appreciate you coming by and taking the time. I know that our audience is varied, but where I want to start is kind of the history of why you're here, because I think without that, culturally, we're going to miss a lot of what you're going to tell us and why it's relevant. So I'd love to start off with the Gulag Archipelago, and I'm going to pull some quotes out of it because I think that they are relevant to what's going on right now in the world. So it'll take me a couple seconds, but this I hope to be a great launch pad into what you're up to. So part of the book, so no sooner had the dust from the post-revolution, Vladimir Lenin was already demanding the most decisive, draconian measures to tighten up discipline. We'll cover that. And a quote from the 7th All-Union Congress of the Soviets, the original formal governing body of the Soviet Union, this is back in 1935, labor is the best means of paralyzing the disintegrative influence of the endless conversations of prisoners among themselves in the course of the more experienced instruction to the newcomers. The camps were required to accommodate no fewer than 300 persons each in order that the cost of the guard and administration should be paid for by the prison's labor. And they were under the jurisdiction of the provincial penal departments. And the workday was set at 8 hours. Because of the novelty of it all, the hasty decision was made to pay all workers for all of their work, other than, of course, those who maintained the camps, at 100% the rate of the corresponding trade unions. So, and there's one more point, and I'll come back to that shortly, but I picked each of those because there is a current metaphor for each of them. This dynamic of dividing labor, basically forced labor, as well as the deliberate use of putting people into separate areas, as well as, curiously, in all of these organizations that espouse what I presume you'll agree is the leftist ideology, these people are paid extremely well for what they do. $250,000 here, $500,000 there. So I just wanted to launch into that part of it and then get more into your experience, because you going from being a Marxist to a libertarian...
Cultural right.
Libertarian,
yeah.
I think is a very unique perspective. I've yet to speak to anyone at length who is either a current Marxist or a former Marxist. And any current Marxists, they tend to not be terribly articulate about what they are up to. So the floor is yours, and if you'd like to start there with your book, The Google Archipelago, and the parallels that I introduced.
Well, the reason I named the book Google Archipelago is because I was making a comparison, of course, to Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. And so what I was getting at there is that, of course, the Google Archipelago is not, corporally punitive, and it is not a slave camp yet. And it doesn't end in possible liquidation of the prisoner yet.
Not physical liquidation.
Not physical disappearance. But it does represent the same kind of gulagging that the Google archipelago does, and that is it disappears people digitally. And it's a digital gulag, as the subtitle of my book is Google Archipelago, the Digital Gulag and the Simulation of Freedom. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that it's kind of like a simulated gulag system in which people are disappeared. There's these non-desirables, these people that are ideologically untamable or they don't accord with the party line. They're prisoners, political prisoners of a system that destroys them in the digital realm, which then has very serious implications and results for them in the meat world, if you will.
The meat world, the quote-unquote real world.
Yeah.
Now, an interesting component to that, to the gulag dynamic of the Google archipelago, is that in the original gulags, they were designated as labor camps, or more specifically, concentration camps.
Right.
And they were specifically called that because they weren't really intended to be prisons per se. And the reason they weren't prisons per se is that they were extrajudicial.
Right.
You didn't have to be arrested. You didn't have to basically go through any formal process. You were just nabbed and tossed into them.
Right.
Right. So the most striking parallel, and if we revert now to a few weeks ago with the Twitter files, to find out that the government was deeply embedded in both Twitter and to Facebook and ultimately to Google in terms of directly controlling what was represented, choosing what goes in, what does not go in, and even choosing the shape of it.
Right.
Runs a very interesting parallel to the original gulags that were, of course, run by the penal system.
Right.
But not in an official legal capacity, which parallels exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's right. There's no legal basis for what's happening in the Google archipelago. They're state-controlled state apparatuses, Twitter, Facebook, Google, etc. So they are. It's not official though. It's illegal what they're doing. In terms of the First Amendment, in terms of their control of and censorship, direct censorship of citizens on the social media platforms and on the web, in the Google sphere. So yeah, there's a parallel there. These were not these were political prisoners in the Gulag archipelago. And similarly, this is political. This whole censorship regime, this propaganda regime, it's entirely politicized, and it's about the party line. It's about enforcing the regime's official narratives and destroying all other narratives. And that's exactly what the Gulag system was meant to do. It was not for criminals per se, it was for political criminals, and this is the same function that the Google archipelago serves.
And I think the important word there is destroys, not censors per se, because we know that they're censoring it.
Right.
We know that they're squelching it, but that at the end of the day, it is a destruction of those messages and destruction of those people, which is a higher level of the activity. For folks that are skeptical about this, let's take a kind of a half a step back. You know, what is your definition of freedom?
Well, freedom really doesn't have a positive definition. It's a negative capacity. It's the ability to do things without constraints that are imposed by the state in particular. So really, there's no positive way to understand liberty outside of its lack through various constraints.
So lack of downward forcing controls, lack of external controls, if you will, lack of restrictions, therefore freedom.
Yeah, now I should say this, I should qualify freedom in this way, that each person has the right to their own self-determination and autonomy and free will and action, but there's one major limitation, is that it doesn't impinge upon the same for other people. So this is the non-aggression principle. So I don't aggress against you, and you don't aggress against me. You don't constrain me in any way, and I don't constrain you in any way. So we don't breach the property rights that each of us has in ourselves.
Got that. As in, an individual is a sovereign piece of property.
That's right.
Whether we look at it as that. Okay, so
Self-owned as well.
self-owned.
Right.
Interesting. Which gets to another piece of the conversation, which we'll cover later, the private property rights and what that actually means to people. And that's why I wanted to start with identifying freedom, because a lot of people, when we talk even loosely about the dynamic of our privacy rights disappearing. We never had a constitutional right to privacy per se,
right.
but we kind of had a cultural, social, and semi-legal right to some elements being private. And as much, people say, well, if I'm not guilty, I have nothing to hide. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing you have something to say about that argument.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the problem with that is that the state and the regime can determine what constitutes guilt at any given time. And so this is really a slippery slope into tyranny. Mm-hmm. And so likewise, the idea of saying that, well, I'm not, you only need to worry if you do something wrong. We don't know whether we're doing anything wrong because they change the rules all the time. Mm-hmm. And the state determines with their own prerogatives what counts as criminality.
Gotcha.
And we see today all kind of rampant criminality that goes unpunished by the regime because it's supportive of the regime. But even things that are innocent are getting punished just because they are opposing the regime. So crime has been totally politicized now.
Not only politicized, but in many jurisdictions legalized.
Yes, that's correct.
Downtown San Francisco just closed its Whole Foods due to employee safety.
Right.
Walmart just pulled out of, I forget the region, but they've closed multiples as 5 to 10 stores. People were pretty upset by that. So criminality has basically been decriminalized.
Yeah, criminality that doesn't oppose the regime's prerogatives. Exactly.
Say more about that, because I'm trying to illustrate for someone who is well outside the political sphere of thinking in their daily lives, mm-hmm. that will kind of hear about this, they'll overhear somebody at a coffee shop mentioning it.
Yeah.
What should they be worried about?
Well, what they should be worried about is, first of all, what's being instituted is anarcho-tyranny. And that is basically there's tyranny over people in their daily lives, ordinary people that aren't criminal, that just want to go about their lives and to undertake the various things that they do, take their kids to school, take their kids to sporting events, or if they don't have kids, do their own thing, hang out with their friends, whatever they want to do. But they're allowing they're making life for ordinary people tyrannical. They're living under tyranny because their ordinary activities are not only impinged by the state, but also by the criminal elements that they're letting run rampant over their lives. So this is what's called anarcho-tyranny. This is what's reigning today.
Interesting. So something as mundane as dropping your kids off at school. Mm-hmm. So what does that look like under anarcho-tyranny?
It looks like the idea that, first of all, you can't have any say in what goes on in the school, mm-hmm. in the school system, mm-hmm. and you don't have any say over whether they start to indoctrinate your child into a particular ideology, and I won't say which ones. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you might get robbed on the way or the way back, and you have no recourse. You can't defend yourself because the state does not permit it. You'll be the criminal if you try to defend yourself against crime. Well,
that's certainly the case in Chicago, San Francisco area,
right.
New York, I believe, and it's getting tighter and tighter.
Right.
So there's that. Now, about 15 years ago, there was a wave of YouTube videos that featured students typically in high school, in some cases elementary school, and the students were being rambunctious to the point of disrespectful and ultimately became violent. So there was a progression on that end of the story.
Right.
To the point that these students, were literally assaulting the teachers. And at the very beginning of that loop, the teachers were fighting back. Because they were like, no, we're not going to tolerate this from a student, but I'm certainly not going to tolerate being assaulted.
Yeah.
But the punchline of that was that the teachers were severely disciplined and probably, and as I recall, in some cases actually fired.
Yeah.
And the incidents didn't concern me on an individual basis. What concerned me was the high volume of them. And that
Yeah.
told me the system itself
Right.
was granting space for this to occur exactly as it was going on.
Yeah.
So is that an example of the anarcho-tyranny,
Yeah, that's-
and an early example of the anarcho-tyranny that you're
That's
talking
definitely anarcho-tyranny. So what is the benefit? Why does the state permit this? Why are they doing this? Because they want to have control. And so when you allow this, you're terrorizing the general population. Okay, this keeps them in line, and this gives them no recourse. They have no recourse to fight back against assaults on their persons, infringements of their own personal liberty, etc. So this makes them captives of the state. This makes them under control. This makes them easier to control. This is part of the control mechanism.
And is the advent of this control, I mean, it's always different. So if
Yeah.
we look at states taking the control, it always takes on a different form. And if we look at the 20s and 30s, it was extremely coercive. I mean, it was
Right.
violent, it was deliberately violent.
Right.
But I can presume that if they were to try that again and it was a knowing state doing it, it probably wouldn't be as successful because we've kind of been there.
Right.
We know what's coming. So war as war is always going to be different. It's always going to mask its intentions. It's always going to mask its progression. Have you seen anything like this before, where it's literally individuals, not operatives, not particular groups, but individuals drafted into acting literally on behalf of the state?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've seen this. I won't get too far into it, but obviously this was part of the COVID regime, where you had basically people enlisted as state agents to enforce the COVID regime's policies. You have people screaming at you for wearing, if you don't wear a mask. You have
Gotcha.
people shaming you for not being vaccinated. You had all of these things. This is part of the state's machinery. They enroll these people. They're unpaid agents of the state. They're paid in the sense that they're not canceled, so they're allowed to keep their careers and occupations and income, but they're not paid anything above and beyond that, except by gratitude through, also the kind of flattery that they receive from the regime. Oh, you think the right way, you're acting the right way, this allows you some self-congratulations.
Yeah.
But other than that, no. This is just this kind of enforcement regime is very typical, though, of a totalitarianism.
Yes.
It's very much like what happened in the Soviet Union. That Solzhenitsyn described how people were dragged out of their homes and their neighbors stayed quiet, or he informed on their neighbors to have them dragged out of their homes. They enforced on them so that they wouldn't be dragged out of their homes. This was a way of an insurance policy against going to the gulag.
And of course, the giant cupcake at the end is that totalitarianism always eats itself.
Yeah.
So it was really just a matter of time before the people that turned in their neighbors,
Are
their
getting
neighbors
turned
them
in. Right.
So there we go.
The left eats itself, but not fast enough.
But not fast enough. That was a great. Wait a minute, that was you.
Yeah, that was me.
I was still laughing about that one. So many people at this point, and certainly people that are watching this, are familiar with probably everything that you just described. But some of the people I observe don't really have an awareness of how we got here. So I'd like to ask you about, I guess briefly, the arrival of the postmodernists, aka Frankfurt School, into the United States in the, I guess, the late 1800s, early 1900s.
No, 1930s.
1930s, that late? Wow, okay.
Yeah.
To my awareness, they landed right here in Santa Monica.
Well, first they landed at Columbia.
All right, okay.
Yeah, in 1933.
Got it.
They emigrated from the Soviet Union and set up shop at Columbia. And then a couple of members, I think at least one, Herbert Marcuse, ended up here in Southern California. I think Santa Barbara. UC Santa Barbara, I believe.
Santa Barbara, UC San Diego comes into that conversation.
Yes, I think he bounced around. I'm not sure exactly, but he ended up out here at one of the UC schools, and then finally at Brandeis in Boston. So, yeah, that was one wave. That's not the postmodernist wave. That's the neo-Marxist Frankfurt School.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah, that's the critical theory wave that came in the 30s. And then proliferated. But there was a second wave that came, and that's the postmodern wave. That came from France, especially, through the theorists in France like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and Jean-Francois Lyotard and others. And their ideas were really influenced strongly by Mao. They were effectively Maoists. And so they had this idea of cultural revolution. And so this is the idea of the Long March Through the Institutions, which was named by a student, a socialist student in Germany, Rudi Dutschke. And he named that he was in correspondence with Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School theorist, when he came up with this idea. So this might be a joint conception, actually, this idea of the Long March Through the Institutions. The idea was that you don't try to overthrow capitalism directly. You first get a hold of all the cultural institutions. You get to the consciousness of the masses through the institutions of education, through all the cultural institutions, through the media, and all of the other, and the apparatuses of the state. You don't try to overthrow the state, you infiltrate the state. So this was the plan, and it's been very successful, quote unquote.
Slow motion and successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does that explain, if the influence was in France, does that explain at all why, for example, Ho Chi Minh studied at the Sorbonne? Was that part of the process, and why he would have ended up in France?
Well, more close to this was the fact that, for example, Mao was promoted. You may have heard this yesterday in my talk. Mao was strongly promoted by Yale University.
Yes, you mentioned, yes.
Yes, Yale in China set Mao up effectively to become China's leader. This is very little known, but it's a fact that the West had a great deal to do with establishing communism in China itself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Say more.
But these are subversive elites.
Okay.
Okay, this is what I call them. There's these subversive elites who have always had as their object a kind of socialism.
Okay.
And because they like monopoly. They like monopoly either for cultural or economic or other reasons. And likewise, they have attempted to foster socialism. They actually, some of these elites in the banking industry and in industry funded the Bolshevik Revolution. They helped to establish Mao. Then they also included Western agents that effectively served the Maoist state in its very early stages. So there's been a great deal of elite subversion of the West.
And it's interesting that most of that has been very conveniently obscured by just painting it over to say the Rothschilds were the ones who financed the revolution, that the Rothschilds were involved in all the wars, even going back to Napoleonic Wars. But that's
a cartoon version of history.
Exactly.
You know, I don't want to go there, and it's not true.
Oh, and it's not true.
Yeah, and it's not true.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
That's an important piece of it.
Well, I mean, there's other parties involved. You know, there's many other parties involved, and they came out of New York. You had Schiff, for example. I forget his first name. Not Adam Schiff, but I think one of his ancestors, actually, who funded the Bolshevik Revolution. They had some particular reasons for it. They hated the Tsar, for one. But they also wanted to establish a kind of captive colony in the Soviet Union, so they would thwart the economic development of that country, of Russia at the time, and at the same time set up a captive colony where they could monopolize particular industries. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting, because if we take a look at the East India Company, you know, would be an example of that, would it not? In terms of Great Britain, basically.
They're colonists. That's a colonist setup.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's you know, that was basically a way of making money in India, and so it's not exactly the same thing, because they aren't trying to create like a socialist state, in effect. You know, they're just exploiting Indian resources and people.
Gotcha.
They aren't trying to establish a socialist state. And then, you know, these subversive elites tried to, through the nonprofit foundations in the United States, they wanted to communize the United States to make it Soviet-like. They were looking for a merger of the Soviet Union and the United States. This is all going back to the 20s and 30s.
Goodness
so
gracious.
these people actually precede the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory coming to the United States. Yeah.
See, that part's fascinating because,
Yeah.
again, the reason I mentioned, the Rothschilds is that it's an easy Band-Aid, true
Yeah.
or not,
Right.
because it hides all the other involvements.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's something that you've talked about that will distress my mother tremendously.
Oh.
She worked for the Gillette Company for the better part of
The
50
Gillette
years.
Company.
So disappoint her by describing how King Gillette.
King Camp Gillette.
King Camp Gillette.
Well, King Camp Gillette was a socialist. And he wrote several books. One was called Human Drift, and the other one was called World Corporation. And so he had this idea that socialism, and this is, by the way, in the early 20th century, okay? So post-Bolshevik Revolution, okay? Oh, no, it's actually a little earlier than the Bolshevik Revolution. So he's writing these books early 1900s.
Wow.
And he's saying that the best way to get to socialism, he hated capitalism he hated laissez-faire capitalism. He did not like competition. He thought it was the root of all evil. So competition was the big enemy. So he thought that what he would do is create a corporation, he called it World Corporation, that would eventually subsume all production under its belt. Everything, one giant conglomerate that would produce all things, all commodities, and then every individual in the world would have equal shares in that corporation, and that effectively would be socialism.
Got it.
Yeah.
Sounds exciting.
So he was a monopolist. You see how monopoly and socialism work together. Socialism is nothing if not a monopoly scheme.
I don't see them in any way doing anything but overlap. I mean, they're inherently linked as far as I've ever seen.
The more monopolization you get, the closer you're getting to socialism.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So but what's the counter to that? Because, so for example, every person I've ever spoken to who says, I hate capitalism because,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. They don't know what, they hate dirty capitalism is what I would call it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
every time they describe whatever their trouble is, it's
Yeah.
always a component, large or small, of some socialist infiltration
That's
into
right.
the capitalist process.
That's exactly right.
And they talk about homelessness.
Right.
But they don't talk about how homelessness is a massive industry. City of
Right.
Los Angeles has pumped, if I'm not mistaken, $7 billion a year
Wow.
for the past several years. And yeah, the problem's obviously been solved,
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So,
If you feed the problem like that, you always make it bigger.
yes. And they're hiding what the problem actually is. It's primarily a drug problem and a
Drugs
mental
and
illness
mental
problem.
illness. That's
and the
right.
misnomer is that it's a homeless issue.
Right. Has nothing to do with like lack of opportunity per se. I
Right.
mean, it isn't about that. And the welfare state does not help produce wealth or welfare, social welfare. It creates more misery. Okay, so
So here's the question.
yeah.
I had a conversation with Yakov Smirnov on his podcast. And I asked him, and it was interesting how you have conversations, you kind of realize something in real time.
Yeah, that's nice.
And he was describing his experience of growing up under Soviet control in the Ukraine. Fascinating, it's back in the news.
Yeah.
And as I began to sit there and think, I said, well, what about a socialist dynamic exists in America that could be a good argument for why we are not necessarily fans of socialism? And as he was describing what he went through with the giant apartment complexes and multiple, dozens, families packed into a single room, I flashed back to a time I visited Berlin and how the giant state apartment buildings, these giant, literally slabs of concrete stacked together and one placed on top like a giant, playing cards, and how it reminded me of the public housing here in the United States. And that little triangulation brought me back to, holy cow, it's literally a gulag. There's not a physical fence. However, when we look at the rents that people pay, I mean, they're heavily subsidized facilities.
Right.
It's run by the state exclusively.
Right.
The low rents that are paid by the residents they could not simply leave and pay market rates, so they are, by all accounts, literally
Captives.
trapped in that environment.
Right.
So we continue to walk down that road, and that road, getting ready for this conversation, takes me back to 1965-66 for the Great Society Act.
Mm-hmm.
And in light of what you just said, or consistent with what you just said, that when you give to a problem in such a way, specifically the state,
Yeah.
you only invite more of it.
Right, exactly.
So Thomas Sowell has been very clear
Very good.
that in the very early part of the 20th century, 77% of all children born to black couples were married. Not the children, but the couples.
Right.
Fast forward, you can see an inversion of those numbers at the Great Society Act.
Yes,
and one of the
absolutely.
more prominent dynamics of that was that if a woman has a baby, she's paid to not have the man in the house.
Right.
And if the man is in the house, she loses her benefits. So that was certainly a co-opting and the original purging of men from any role of influence in the family and ultimately in the society, because more of the benefits were handed to women than men, and women with children. So many people look at that as a racial component. I personally don't see it as racial as much as I do guinea pig, meaning it's an easily captive audience. We have an easily identifiable audience. And it's an audience also that the general public, for lack of a nicer term, really doesn't care about. So whatever happens to them, largely out of indifference, I'm not even saying that there's a racial motivation to it. I'm saying here's a group that's over there, and I don't have to worry about them over there. So they become the perfect set of guinea pigs to test out more aggressive policing.
Yes.
Public housing and sanctioning people into what we now know as concentration camps.
Effectively. This is right.
And we fast forward now 40, 50 years, what are we looking at? 77% of all black children are born to single mothers.
Yeah.
It's directly inverted.
Right.
So also pointed out that prior to the Great Society Act, the majority of black people were in their own business. It killed off completely the entrepreneurial bent of the black community.
Absolutely.
So when I look at that, I look at the dynamic that the black community was directly and openly at the time bribed into supporting the Great Society Act and everything that follows.
Right.
So that worked. So why are we at, so what is the mechanism, what is the equation that you see now that they just didn't simply bribe students? I mean, I guess they're bribing students by sort of pseudo-promising that their student loans will be erased.
Yeah.
But I don't see the bribery taking place as directly as it was in the 60s.
The bribery of whom exactly?
The bribery of their target audience.
Oh, okay, of the target audience. Yeah, there's a lot of that bribery going on.
Okay. What does it look like today?
There's still a lot of, there's an acceleration of these kinds of programs of wealth transfers, right? And here in California, you just, there's a bill, I think, I don't know if it's been passed or not, but it's on the table, that, you know, you have a gradation of, depending on your income, it'll determine what rate you pay for your electricity.
Yes, I heard about that just a few days ago. And also your interest rate on your credit cards, if you actually have good credit, you're going to have to pay more.
You pay more with good credit. So they're going to penalize the credit worthy for the uncredit worthy in order to, so they're building loyalty, bribing off this, ingratiating this particular class of people, and it's certainly not strictly racial.
Right.
They're trying to use this to ingratiate this particular audience and then weaponize them against the majority.
Yes, and thank you for following there, because I completely blew my own punchline. I was going to mention that the experimental group was an experimental group to be used to police, control everyone.
Yeah.
So thank you for following
that's right.
on that.
That's right. It's a captive colony used as a test case scenario to expand to the general population.
Gotcha. So one of the aspects that I came across regarding the gulags was observers, after the fact, of course, surprised that the gulags had started as early as they had. So
right away.
By some reports, they started in 1921, but other reports, they started as early as 1918. Now, the parallel is, what about our freedoms have long been gone? now that we're just talking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very good parallel. So yeah, a lot of Marxists will tell you that, you know, it was all Stalin, right? But they don't realize that Lenin was a butcher, okay? And he started assassinating people immediately. And they started concentration camps in 1918.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it wasn't called the Gulag system yet. It wasn't the Gulag system, but it was concentration camps. So, yeah, their freedoms were gone earlier than they thought. Similarly, I think ours have been abrogated as well, long before we thought they were.
Gotcha.
I can't put a date on it, but I would say we're looking at a continual erosion over time. First of all, look at the fact that we have an IRS. You know, why was that established? Where's this in the Constitution that they can extort this money from us at gunpoint effectively? Now they are going to literally have guns, IRS agents, 87,000 new ones have been hired or being hired. So yeah, I mean, you know, you see all of these things that are established that really started to really abrogate our freedom and our liberty and our property rights. The establishment of the Federal Reserve. I think very soon, not too far before the IRS was established, or maybe in the same year, actually.
Well, the Federal Reserve goes back to Hamilton and his battle to prevent it from occurring. And there was a time it had gone away, and then it came back. So that battle has kind of been off and on for many decades.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's first they started with infringements of our property rights, and then freedom of speech.
Couldn't hold gold for a while.
Search and seizure. All of those things have been breached. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of erosion that's gone on, but yeah, we're only now noticing that. Our speech is being curtailed, that it's being squelched, and that not only are they censoring us, but Google is curating, and Facebook and Twitter, not to a lesser extent maybe, I don't know, they're curating reality at this point. They are determining what reality is. So they're, you know, by disappearing particular information, by stacking information in such a way that you can't get to any information about certain topics.
What do you mean by stacking?
The results search stacking.
Oh, got it, okay.
Yeah, so they bury things that they don't want you to see.
Yeah, that has been one of the most curious things that I've discovered in conversation with people, because I do my best, as we all say we do, to get our information from a variety of sources.
Right.
But what I've found, to your point, is that when I speak to people, they have an entirely different and utterly unrelated set of information as compared to what I have.
Right.
And that's when I really began to see that not only is this arguments in the street, so to speak, not fighting about the same battles, but it's clearly deliberate.
Yes, we're not even agreeing on the same reality about which we're discussing.
Yeah.
So people, this is part of the game. I think this is part of the plan.
I'd vote sure. I believe it.
Yeah.
Years ago, I worked for an artificial intelligence company at the early days.
So did I.
See, there we go.
But I was in an AI lab in the University of Carnegie Mellon. Yeah.
I was about an inch outside the university, because this company was founded by a university professor, and he actually had one of the early search engines. So this is obviously several years before Google. I mean, there was many search engines even here before Google. But he started an artificial intelligence company, and I worked for it for about 2.5 years, and I was in Ireland. The capital of encryption, by the way, which I found fascinating. And based on the service that we were providing, you could program different devices to do things. You could program a VCR remotely. You could do any number of things. But as I got more familiar with the technology, what I observed was the reverse was also true. You could tell the technology from the back end that you're programming it to tell the user certain things. You could push certain things. Now we don't think about that now because it's commonplace.
Yes.
But this wasn't happening then.
Right.
And this was the first time that I had seen it.
Yeah.
So you can push recommendations for movies.
So they're programming you.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was the advent of that. So I saw the onset of being able to push way more. Well, I mean, it to me was obvious what was going to happen next.
Yeah.
So again, going back to when this began, long before we realized it, I recognized years ago, and that's why I sort of keep, this is kind of what started my journey in this entire conversation, certainly around technology. Because now we're in a situation where we are digitally isolated.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And in my view, I've never seen it any different from a digital gulag, because if I'm getting specific information that my neighbor is literally not getting, I mean, somebody sitting next to me on their phone an inch away is not getting the same information, we're now isolated by definition.
Yeah.
And then if I'm being prodded, pushed, etc., I don't see that there's any functional difference between being in a gulag versus not. The only thing that I'm aware of is that it's not overtly forced labor, but we're still actively participating in it.
Yeah. Well, some leftists would say it's forced labor. They call it digital exploitation. You know, every time you do a Google search, you're actually exploited. I don't buy that. I think, you know, there's an exchange going on, but
between who and who, though?
Between the provider and you.
Okay.
But the contract is hidden from you. You don't know the fact that you've given up your privacy in advance, and everything else, your searches are saved, and the NSA probably has access to them at any time.
There's no probably.
Yeah, there's no probably there. So yeah, I mean, Google was funded by In-Q-Tel, of course, a CIA funding agency. So funded by the state, by the intelligence community altogether. So was Facebook, actually, through another intermediary. I forget if it's Planeteer, probably.
Planeteer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
and then
that's more recent, is it not? Or is Planeteer older than I think it is?
It's older than you think. It's Peter Thiel's startup, and they funneled the funds from In-Q-Tel to Facebook.
Gotcha.
And Microsoft was also funded by In-Q-Tel. So there's a lot of funding. Oracle, I believe, as well. So these have always been state apparatuses. So about the digital gulag and the digital siloing you're talking about, you know, it isn't just that some people are in an alternative universe, and you know, but some people are in the universe that's approved of. Okay, that the regime wants you to be in. That's why they're shutting down the other sources. That's why Tucker Carlson was fired today.
Wow.
That's why you know, they have basically outlawed people from Facebook and Twitter and social media. Why Google stacks its search results. There's a regime narrative and a series of narratives that they want you to have. That puts you in the right universe of discourse, and the other one is verboten largely.
And it seems to me that the previous one that we just talked about was actually for basically passive, meaning you didn't know what was going on.
Right.
And now it's overt.
Oh, it's overt.
Did they merely play their hand, or do you think that there's a strategic dynamic to making it overt? Going back to intimidating.
Yeah, there's
public.
Possibly ritual humiliation going on, and
oh, funny.
Yeah, exactly.
Funny you should mention.
Yeah.
Because ritual humiliation and demoralization is a huge piece of what.
Demoralization, and also gaslighting, tremendous gaslighting. So we're being told, we're seeing with our own eyes what's going on. They're doing outrageous things and then denying it immediately. So we're going to get to the point, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about language. I think we're going to get to a point, and we may already be there, where we will not have the language to describe the kinds of machinations that are underway that are being played out on us.
Meaning akin to Orwell's reduction of the vocabulary?
Yes, reduction of the vocabulary, but the increase in the mechanisms that they're actually using, such that we can't even describe what they are anymore.
Right, makes sense. And if we look at the advent of ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence languages, or language tools,
right?
I mean, I'm a pretty decent writer. What I see isn't as good as what I can do, but it's good enough.
It could be.
And I can totally see that the ongoing use of it, just like anything that does it for you, your intellect's going to atrophy.
It's gonna
your ability
atrophy.
to write is going to atrophy, and lo and
Outsource it.
behold, the
Yeah.
language is going to get smaller.
Yeah, you're going to outsource it to other entities, and then they're going to have basically their own prerogatives, and that's going to make it impossible. You know, like Jordan Peterson said, censorship isn't just about not the inability to say what you want to say. It becomes the inability to think
Yes,
at all.
at all.
At all.
Yeah.
So thought will disappear. It'll be impossible to actually conceive of things.
Yeah.
And this is really the scariest prospect I've seen yet of anything, because at least in the Gulag, you could still have your own thoughts.
Right. Oh,
But they were trying to brainwash you and trying to ideologically indoctrinate you. But nevertheless, you could still have your own thoughts, as that book is a testament to.
Gotcha.
Look at all those thoughts in there.
right. Once you're off work for you doing your 8-hour shift.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Got it. Interesting. So, okay, so thank you for all that.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned one of the most horrifying advents in your estimation, digital ID.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're hearing about it on a daily basis. We're being encouraged to get our digital ID for convenience, for safety,
Right.
for fun and games. What's your take?
Oh, I mean, the digital ID is the beginning of closing the totalitarian circle, because it represents a database about you, and it'll include basically all activities from cradle to grave. Now, some of us have been born a while, so you know they won't get back that far, but from the inception to your death and beyond, likely. It is a it represents this centralized knowledge base about yourself that will be inclusive of all kinds of behaviors. It'll be inclusive of your online activity. It'll be inclusive. Well, you know, I think this whole idea of there being an online versus an offline, that's way over. You know,
I don't think it ever existed.
yeah, there's never been an outside the Google archipelago or the digital gulag.
Yeah.
It went since the digital realm was invented.
I mean, I'll give you a perfect case in point. I mean, your and I initial association happened via Facebook.
Right.
And our ongoing association happened via Facebook and other people that we know via Facebook.
Right.
And here you are sitting in front of me right now.
Right.
And I've had people argue that any digital association doesn't really exist. It's not real.
Yeah.
And I said, I have evidence to the contrary, and a lot of it, because there's a lot of people I've met via the internet, via social media, that are now in my actual life. In fact, there's a gentleman who is a member here who I met online, who coincidentally turned up here. And it's pretty stunning to me.
Yeah.
So I've never perceived that the digital realm, if you will, is separate at all from the real realm.
Right.
And I think people who don't realize that are going to be rudely awakened.
In for a surprise if they ever figure it out.
Okay, so thank you for that. So moving forward, every totalitarian regime has had its partisans, it's had its opposition, its counter forces, counterinsurgents. What do you see moving forward? Who are the counterinsurgents in this conversation?
Well, they're the people that are vilified the most. So whatever they saved their worst epithets for, that's your counterinsurgency.
Gotcha.
That's your dissidence. So what they're going to try to do is continue to label you in the most negative ways possible to delegitimate and then erase and cancel. So whoever's being canceled, that's your dissident.
Which is an interesting contrast to the statement of who's in charge. Just take a look at who you can't criticize.
Right.
But who are the insurgents? Take a look at who you can criticize. That's a very interesting flip of the coin.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, whoever you can criticize, whoever is, whoever they invite you to have the most vitriol for, those are the people that are the contingent. That's the dissident, counterinsurgent contingent. I think it's a larger number than they'll let us know. I think that there's a great. I talk to a lot of people, and I think, here's what I thought I had yesterday. What if wokeness was really only about 5% of the population, and 95% of it was just digital bots, in effect? And so they've made it appear to be larger than it is, right? Woke ideology and woke imperatives and all that. And so we don't know what the real contingent of the resistors are, because we don't know what the real contingent of the partisans, of the compliant are.
Right, because they've been shut down. Now, the evidence to your point kind of came out once Elon Musk purchased Twitter.
Yeah.
Because even in the purchase process, the process was delayed significantly by his request asking for, tell me how many bots are back there.
Right.
And they balked, and they did their best to refuse to let him know. Right. He took them to court, lawsuits, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
And then he went ahead with the purchase, and lo and behold, there's massive numbers of bots.
The bots are outrageous. So, you know, they can reproduce their supporters just digitally. They can digitally reproduce. This is what's scary about AI. It's the fact not only we're going to have independent, autonomous agents running around doing things, but they can reproduce them and have reproduce the same ideological propensities and enforcement regime. These AI bots are going to be police officers of the mind, and the body, but they're going to be police officers of the mind, and they're reproducing them at a rate that we can't possibly even conceive of.
So this literally underscores what people have told me frequently.
Yeah. That
the film The Matrix is not a fictional story.
No, it was predictive programming.
Documentary, predictive programming.
Yeah, predictive programming. I mean, it was kind of like a foretelling what was going to happen.
Gotcha,
and it was kind of like, you could say, programming the population into what to expect.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Prospects for the future? Does Glenn Greenwald...
I'm always asked these questions, and what do we do, and all that. I'm not answer man, okay, on those things. I can't tell you. If I knew what to do and how to do it to win, I would have done so already. So I can't tell you that I have all the answers. The only thing I can say is that we will resist, and there is a contingent that is very recalcitrant that will not go under this regime silently, and we will struggle. And I think the least we can do will be to leave a remnant, to be a remnant that leaves a legacy of liberty for the future. That's the least we can do.
And what does that look like?
It could be living on, basically going into like Amish type living style, getting away from the matrix, getting out of it, and refusing the digital identity, refusing the CBDCs, refusing their whole regime, and refusing the AI, not because we're Luddites, okay? This is the way, that's another thing they'll do, is to peg us as Luddites in order to say, look, all those people that reject technology, they're just backward retards. You know, that's what they're going to try to do.
Got it.
But really what it comes down to is that we're rejecting these technologies because who's controlling them? Because they're using them as tools and weapons. That's why we're tools of oppression and weapons of punishment. That's why we're refusing their technologies.
Very powerful. Well, Dr. Michael Rectenwald, thank you so much for your time and these remarkable insights.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you so much again for joining us for Two People on the Planet. We've been talking with Dr. Michael Rectenwald, and we'll see you next time.